Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth and final core conversation of spring 2021. I am Charlie Thomas. I'm the Executive Director of ACTC, the Association for Core Texts and Courses, that is sponsoring these and conducting these core conversations. ACTC is an international professional organization for teachers, mainly undergraduate teachers, who use world classics and texts of cultural significance in their classrooms. So we love books and we promote conversation, and that's what ACTC is about. So when the pandemic hit and we couldn't gather around tables to talk about books, we decided to use Zoom to talk about books this way. So I am very happy today to have a chance to introduce to you our speaker. She will speak, but also our sort of interlocutor for this hour, because we'll talk together, Molly McGrath. Molly is a professor of philosophy at Assumption University, where she's also the director of the honors program. And I get to work with Molly most often because she's a member of the board of directors of ACTC. Thank you, Molly, for your work for ACTC and for being here today to talk with us about Freud. So I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Well, thank you, Charlie, for all the work that you do for ACTC. And I'm happy to talk about Freud. I guess I'll just start with reasons why I've decided to teach this text, Civilization and Its Discontents. Basically, I've built it into an ethics class, and it's because I wanted to address this question with students about whether or not they should be true to themselves. It's the kind of thing they hear incessantly, from childhood, that they should be true to themselves. Other people should also be true to themselves, and we should all be nice, being, true to ourselves together, and never be mean to someone else for being themselves, that kind of stuff, right? And they see it on cat posters, and there's, this is kind of hallmark wisdom that I think the young especially are inundated with throughout grade school and high school. And so they show up in college, and frankly, I want to pop that balloon. Right. And I think Freud helps me pop that balloon. He's kind of like an anti-cat poster, view of human nature. I start the class with Emerson, his essay on self-reliance, which is, ultimately Emerson's advice that you should be true to yourself and follow every whim has to do with Emerson's view that inside we are all united to somehow this divine thing, the oversoul, that he's a kind of pantheist, transcendentalist, and so the trust in being true to yourself comes from really a metaphysical belief about the nature of reality, our relationship to the divine, and that we all have in our inward soul some kind of direct channel in which we can become prophets of the divine if we just tune into or tap into this primeval source or spring inside of our souls. And so the students often they'll sometimes see something wrong with this, like 2 + 2 = 5 can be, true for me today, and I should say it. That's basically Emerson's view. So they can be critical of it, but they find it very difficult to be critical of the overall advice that you should be yourself and should be true to yourself. And so I want to puncture that balloon with Freud. That's not to say that I think that there's partial truth in almost everything, right? So there's something to be said for being true to yourself. But I do think the balloon needs to be punctured, and he helps me do that. The second reason I want to teach Freud is because he's crazy and wrong and kooky in so many ways, right? But at the same time, he's utterly brilliant. I think this is an absolutely brilliant text. And it's sprinkled in or salted, with just outrageously weird, sometimes perverse things. And I think that's actually really good for students to read today, especially because our world is becoming more and more sanitized. When someone makes a mistake, we want to get rid of them. When a text says something wrong or stupid, we say, don't teach it. And I think that's becoming more and more a temptation of our culture. And I think our students need the opposite. I think our students need to see someone being both brilliant and stupid on the same page. And then they need to learn to tell the difference, because they're not going to get by in life, because the world that they encounter won't actually be sanitized of error. They need to get by in life with this ability to distinguish between when Freud is being stupid and when he's being brilliant. And so I tell them in advance, I think he's brilliant and I think he's stupid, and I want them to try to sort that out. And that we're not going to throw the book away merely because he says some really, really weird things, right? And it's embarrassing to teach a book that says such weird things, and you have to explain to your students. My favorite one is, and we can talk more about this later if you want, is his theory about the origin of civilization, that human beings capture fire. He says this in a footnote. Human beings capture fire because there was one man who could resist what was a homoerotic impulse of peeing on fire. Right? So this is his theory about the origin of civilization. And I think that's worth talking about. I think it's a fun idea. I can explore it. I think there are things to say about it. But ultimately, I think it's wrong and really just kind of a stretch. And I think to recognize that in Freud, while also giving him credit for being brilliant, is something that's very useful in the classroom. Third reason to teach him, I kind of want to prepare my students for being dissatisfied. I don't think it's just midlife. You know, I think that there's something built into human life that they are going to be dissatisfied, despite all their best strategies, despite all their best efforts and hard work, and even everything going right. They're going to be discontent, and I want to prepare them for that moment. And I think that Freud actually has a theory which is inadequate in so many ways about what human beings are like. Right. And we can talk more about how inadequate he is and what his vision of the human being is and why it's wrong, but it's not all wrong. And I think that he sees very clearly certain things about human beings that actually, in fact, make it impossible for us to be happy, in some sense of happy, in the sense of satisfied. And I think that the students should hear that in advance, simply to be prepared for life. And to be prepared for those moments in life in which they might be tempted to think that if they're irresponsible, they would be happy. And to be told in advance, that's actually not true, right? It's not true that by being utterly irresponsible, you will discover happiness. And finally, fourth reason that I think it's a good thing to teach this to undergraduates, I kind of want to scare them straight about the vulnerability of civilization. I think that to live in a stable, relatively prosperous, incredibly imperfect, but also a relatively just and stable order, judged by the standards of history and the standards of, you know, what might happen in the future, it can make you very complacent about the good that we have, and it can make you not realize how vulnerable it is, how fragile what civilization does for us, how fragile that is. And I think that there's something very scary in Freud, because he sees, again, very clearly that there are forces in human nature which aren't going away and which would destroy civilization very quickly. And I think that changes your attitude about how to fix the problems that you see, right? Because we often live in a throwaway culture. You know, it's much cheaper to throw away your TV and buy a new one than to fix it. Right. There are lots of things in the world like that. But I don't think that's true of civilization. Right. And I think that Freud sees that clearly. He helps us see that clearly. And I don't think that undergraduates often will see that clearly because they've been told by the cultural superego about what the world should be like. And they want to measure the world by those standards. And when the world doesn't fit those standards, the temptation might be to throw it away and start over. And Freud talks about these kind of primitivist movements, and we see them everywhere today with, like, you know, paleo diets and stuff like that. There's a paleo movement. And there's also, I think that shows up in politics and in civilizational thought in general, that maybe it would be better just to throw it away. And I think that it's healthy for them to be a little bit scared by the very fragility of civilization. So, those are my primary reasons for building him into my ethics class for undergraduates. I don't think he's the whole truth. I think he's the member of a conversation that needs to be there. His contribution, I think, needs to be there, but I don't want to stop there. And from Freud, you know, I go Emerson to Mill to Kant to Freud. And then after Freud, I do Aristotle, right? And I think Aristotle adds some things that Freud misses. But that isn't to say that you have to throw Freud out. You know, he makes some points that we should also hold on to. I think it would help a little bit to go through the text. It's a well-organized book, 8 chapters, and it's extremely readable. The first chapter starts with, Freud attacking the idea of God, but it's really not just that. I mean, Freud does that in other places. What he's really attacking is Emerson's idea of God, this kind of view that we all have in us, this oceanic feeling, is the proof of God. That's the view he's attacking, that we all have in us this direct communication pipeline to the divine, inside of ourselves. And instead, he gives us this view of the id and the ego. The id is basically a set of basic primary drives, and the ego emerges out of the id gradually as a kind of manager, right? Because the id has all desires and drives and is constantly frustrated by the world. The ego arises as a manager because the id can't get what it wants all the time. So the ego is kind of oriented towards reality. The id is oriented towards its own satisfaction. And the fact is that the it needs the ego. There are all kinds of problems with that, right? But it's also kind of true. So I think chapter 1 starts with that basic idea of what it means to be human for Freud. It's not the Emerson view that you're inside really this beautiful star, the expression of a divine idea. And it's really kind of reductionistic all the way down to this id thing, the it inside of us, a collection of drives. And the rest of the book is largely about that relationship between the id and the ego. What is in the id, and how is the ego going to try to deal with it? The second chapter is about our desire for happiness. He's defining happiness again inadequately. Happiness for him is pleasure without pain. And I think that philosophically that's inadequate, but it's also where many people start. And so he identifies 3 primary sources of suffering. They are our own bodies, the external world, physical nature, and other people, right? And then he identifies strategies that people use in order to try to get happiness despite these sources of suffering. And these strategies include various forms of displacement or substitutional satisfactions or deflections or intoxications, right? So you can forget the world in drugs or alcohol, or you can, deny that there's really a problem. This is something that I know a lot of people who do this, who just pretend like that's not a problem. And will actually deal with the world as though the problem did not exist. Or substitutional satisfactions, so I can't get, say a romantic partner that I like, so I just throw myself more into philosophy, human beings are doing that kind of thing all the time. And so he basically lists strategies, and he says, look, these strategies work, some, and none of them work completely. And different people, have different success with different strategies. And so there's just this kind of pessimistic, realistic view of whether or not we can have happiness. Chapter 3, he gives us a definition of civilization. I really like this chapter, in which civilization is our cooperative attempt to confront these sources of suffering. And it involves material culture like buildings and highways, and it involves medicine and hygiene, and it involves art and philosophy. It involves law. He has this, but all of these put together are cooperative attempts to try to deal with the sources of suffering, and therefore to try to get us to be more happy by uniting together. That's his definition there. 4 is about eros. So according to him, the id, that's the primary place where you start. That's like your original identity. The id, the it inside of you, is made up primarily of 2 drives, or families of drives, the eros and thanatos. And here he's talking about eros. Eros is love, thanatos is death. And eros, sometimes you think that just means something like lust, right? And for Freud, really, it does sometimes just mean lust. And he does sometimes reduce eros to lust. And then other times he's much better about that and admits that eros takes on all kinds of different forms. It doesn't just have to be lust. But the idea is that we have these primary drives, is the erotic drives, and that civilization requires their repression and their substitution. So for example, instead of being satisfied sexually, a group of people might bind together tribally. And he sees that as a kind of substitutional way to express this primal drive you have in you to be united to other human beings. But one of the key points here is that civilization is just going to require you to control your sexual impulses. And I think that's true, right? And I think it's something that students need to be told, right? That's something that civilization is going to require of you. And that's not going to always be pleasant, you know? The fifth chapter is about how dangerous human beings are. He says, man is not a kind of animal that is like tame and friendly and only gets aggressive when it's attacked. No. In fact, unless this drive towards aggression is controlled, it will simply go after others, attack them, you know, and this drive to death, this drive towards destruction, he just sees as a primeval part of human nature, and there's no getting rid of it. He thinks that some people have these theories, like he talks about the communists, for example, who think that this drive towards destruction and anger and hatred all comes from property. And he says, you know, I think we could improve our civilization if we improve the way property was structured, but this is just terribly naive. Aggression exists before property, right? And there's no single bullet theory here in which you could say, like, oh, if we only solve this one problem, then human aggression would go away and we'd all just like hold hands all the time and live in human solidarity. And he says, in fact, that belief is the source of a lot of aggression. So if you believe that property is the source of all aggression, and then you're going to go out to destroy property, then you're also going to destroy the people who are trying to protect property, and then you're going to end up killing 20 million people, right? He sees that that's like the kind of thing that happens, which is why he also is very cynical about global humanitarianism. Global humanitarianism, you know, like love everybody all the time, really turns an excuse to hate those people who are not global humanitarians, right? And so he sees in human nature, it's very tricky, this drive to aggression and destruction. Even when you think you're really thwarting it, even when you think you're going to destroy it, you're really just playing into it. And he sees that as very dangerous. So I think one of the things that he allows us to understand is the tribalism that sometimes takes over human beings is both driven by Eros, a kind of displaced Eros, and driven by Thanatos, by the death drive. And that these two things can really cooperate in a certain kind of tribalism. I'm thinking of a bumper sticker that you see. I'm here in Massachusetts. You see like this little boy peeing on like the Yankees. Okay. So this is a Boston thing. And I think you see here both, Freud would see that as both displaced Eros and as displaced, you know, aggression, you know, and that it's kind of fused in this symbol that is binding the tribe of Boston together, right? And so that's the kind of way that Freud talks about this. Now, in the next chapter, chapter 6, he talks about the death drive. I'm really kind of skeptical. I think what happened was that he experienced World War I and all the terrible stuff about World War I, and he just had this realization that human beings have a death drive in them, and that it's primary. So there's Eros and there's Thanatos, and they're built into human beings. I'm very skeptical of that, partly because I just think we can describe, without that hypothesis of some kind of basic drive towards destruction, I think we can do a decent job of explaining why it is that people would get angry, namely because the world sucks, and because we're weak, and because other people suck too, right? And so when you want the world to be a certain way, either because your id has desires that are not being satisfied, or because your superego, your idea about the way the world should be, your conscience has high standards that are not being met, either of those things become reasons to be angry at reality. And I think that that's enough explanation for me for why some people want to destroy things. You know, they get angry and they put their fist through a wall or something like that, right? They're angry at reality for not being what they want it to be, or what they think it should be. So I both really appreciate Freud's insistence on human aggression and destructiveness, and I think our students really need to hear it. And at the same time, I'm not convinced by him that it's like at the core of the human being. And one of the things I like about Freud here is it's going to be a temptation, which again is playing into the death drive. It's going to be a temptation of everyone to think that we are Eros and those other people are Thanatos, right? that our students are going to think, oh yeah, like look at those people out there with all that aggression and the destructiveness, you know, whereas I'm the global humanitarian. And one of the things that Freud really just, if you do it right, you realize I have this in me too. And no one in the classroom should be allowed to think that they are free of these drives. And I think our students need to hear that they are actually dangerous. Rather than being naive about themselves, again, Emerson style, naive about themselves, and that fundamentally, if we all just followed our whims, that the world would be this beautiful place in which we all get along. Next chapter, chapter 7, almost done, is about conscience. And his theory of conscience, I teach other texts on conscience in this class too, which are much less reductionistic. I think that with Freud, his theory of conscience is true, but not the whole truth, right? So there's this idea that civilization needs to control you. That part's true. In order to do that, it's going to indoctrinate you. That part is true. And then you internalize it. That part is true. And then you beat yourself up for not fulfilling the ideal that civilization has given you by an internalization of the death drive. I think, that sounds right to me. Okay. And then what the view that you get then is that civilization, or rather to put it this way, the civilized person, as opposed to the person who happens to live in civilization, the civilized person is the one who is thoroughly internalized the cultural superego, the cultural version of the way things should be, the cultural rules, and therefore, by having internalized so intimately the culture's view of right and wrong, and by inverting the aggressive drive into themselves, they become the most civilized, and they're constantly torturing themselves, right? So you really begin to see here why civilization requires discontent of all of its members. I think that is also true. What I think is missing is an account of conscience as actually a form of knowledge. And I think this is missing throughout all of Freud's treatment, that there's nothing transcendent in the human being in which reason actually works to discover truth or to know things. And finally, chapter 8, it's on the limits of happiness. You know, he thinks that to be civilized is to be discontent in various ways. First of all, because the id can't actually get what it wants. The ego does a decent job of managing it, and civilization helps us manage it. And it's probably the case that civilization helps us fulfill the id better than any other situation, but it's still the case that the id is going to be frustrated. But second reason, the very management of the id that allows civilization to happen is also going to produce its own frustrations, its new ways of, self-torture and frustrations. And so he just thinks, you got to get used to this if you're going to be civilized. And then he also ends here on a reflection on how vulnerable civilization is. In his view, there's this kind of cosmic battle. So in the end, it turns into this kind of traditional dualism between love and hate, a cosmic battle between Eros and Thanatos, between love and destruction, in which he's not sure that civilization can survive. And he writes this in 1930, 1931, right as his civilization is about to just go into a death spiral, right? So there's something really terrifying about that. I think that's useful for our students to reflect on. So that's what I have to say, Charlie. Do you have any questions or comments, complaints?
Oh gosh, no complaints. That's just fantastic. So I have a question or two that I'd love to ask you and take a minute to talk with you about. But before I do that, I want to remind everybody watching that they can join this conversation too. We'll be on Zoom live on March 26th at 10 a.m. So this is just the beginning of this conversation, not the end. Yeah, this just so great. I mean, I guess in order to get to my question, I'll indulge in just a little bit of rumination. One of the things that strikes me so strongly as you present this text and your reasons for teaching it is how beautiful this is as a text that, as you say, gets a lot of things wrong, but in a very core texts kind of way, just, to sort of come from where we are here at ACTC. I mean, he's getting Emerson either right or wrong, but I think maybe a little bit wrong. He's getting, this sort of understanding of happiness is just straight out of utilitarianism, which one can, if you've talked through these texts, if you've done either Bentham or Mill with undergraduates, they should have opinions, first of all, on what the strengths and weaknesses are of a utilitarian definition of happiness, but also how well or poorly Freud is presenting it, and to what extent this definition of happiness is a fundamental pillar to the whole project. So I just love this as, because I'm a philosopher too, as you know. I love this as an ethics text, but I really am struck in your presentation about what a great text this is for near the end of a core program, whether that core program is just 2 semesters long or 8 semesters long, how much this brings together and raises for conversation. But here's, so maybe there's a question in there somewhere or a comment you'd like to make, but here's the more direct question. And again, it's also coming from a sort of ACTC kind of perspective. I am so appreciative of this. I guess it's your second reason for teaching Freud, this idea that students their education should not be sanitized, and students should read crazy, wrong, brilliant things, full of things that are partially, have partial truths to them. And Freud is one of those figures. There's a kind of a handful of figures in this world of core texts and core courses that the first thing people are apt to say is about how they've been repudiated. Freud, if you have any psychologist or even a student who's taken intro psychology in the room, they'll go, "Oh, Freud," and it's funny because, just 2 core conversations ago with Dan Cullen, we talked about Rousseau, and Rousseau's like that too. If you have anybody, even somebody who's taken 1 semester of a certain kind of political theory course, and they're going to be like, "Oh, Rousseau's evil." And the more they've done political theory, the more likely they're either to say he's sacred or profane, right? And so Freud is one of those texts that people have that first, that sort of chart their course by that first sense of where he sits in the history of the discipline of psychology. And yet, because of some of that first stuff that I was saying, he is so, regardless, let's just stipulate that he's wrong about everything. I don't think he is, but let's just stipulate he's wrong about everything. He would still be a fantastic voice to have, I think, in just about any core program. So here's the question. It's how do you talk to yourself, to your students, to your colleagues about the importance of teaching wrong-headed people? And you've already begun to talk about this a little bit, so I'm really asking you to expand on this a little bit, because I think right now there's a tendency, and I don't mean to, this is going to sound too dismissive, and I don't mean it to be, but there's this sense that adopting a text for a course is like retweeting somebody, that it's a gesture of advocacy. And it seems to me that is a terrible way to think about what it means to adopt text. It's a terrible way to think about the relationship of a teacher to the text they present. It's a terrible way to think about what a curriculum should be or what a class should be. And yet, on the other hand, we know that certain problematic ideas are perpetuated because they're, included in curricula, and there is a problem if these things, if whether it's not it's your intention, you're perceived as an advocate for everything you teach. There's sort of a real practical problem here. So how do you think about this? How do you what Freud perhaps in particular, but maybe just in general, about presenting things that you don't have any interest in advocating for, but you think are important or powerful, or let's just leave it at that, important or powerful things for students to engage?
That's a key pedagogical question for anybody who teaches classic texts, right? And so my personal strategy, and people have different personalities in the classroom, right? My personal strategy is I always sell it. You know, when I'm teaching Descartes, you think I love Descartes, and then you find out 3 weeks later that I hate Descartes. Like, that's how I am. And I think that it helps students take Descartes seriously. Whereas if I wink at them ahead of time and I say, you know, I don't like this guy, I'm setting him up so that you can understand something or other, but I don't really approve. If I say that, then they don't take him seriously. They don't read him well. And then they don't learn what they have to learn from him. And so when I teach Freud, you know, I'll throw in a criticism here and there, but I really try to sell what's true in him. And that makes it even more dangerous, as you say, because if teaching is viewed as a retweet, you know, of whatever text that you have, and on top of that, I'm really selling it as containing at least partial truths that need to be taken seriously, then that becomes, you know, more dangerous. I think the way I handle it is that in the class, we go through different phases, right? And so if you wait until you get to, you know, when I teach Aristotle, then the problematic ways in which I've taught Freud kind of, you know, are softened a little bit. And I also just tell students, you know, like, I tell them regularly, I don't teach anything that's dumb. But there isn't a single thing that I teach that I agree with every word either. And so the idea is to get really smart ideas, for people who are real smart and they have thought something out really carefully, and they're going to help us think better, but none of them is just right, you know, about everything. And I tell them that pretty regularly. And I think that they need to hear that. It's really important that they know that there's no guru out there who knows it all, and that they just find the right person they can learn from him or her. But it's also really important that they don't think that they can just throw pot shots at somebody because they make an error here and there, and therefore not take them seriously. That navigating that is really hard for human beings, but it seems to me like just simply one of the things we're trying to teach them as college students and then as citizens. About the psychology thing, I think it's actually really funny how Freud fits into the history of psychology, because he's not taken seriously. Psychology wants to get over him or anything like him because they are obsessed with being scientific, right? But the fact of the matter is that in that they are exactly like Freud. Freud was obsessed with being a scientist, right? And when you read a book like this and he starts saying something like, and we know from the scientific evidence, and you know he's about to say something that's outrageously stupid, right? It's the things that he doesn't preface with a statement like that. When he says, like, sometimes I think such and such, and you're like, wow, that's a good thought. But if he does the chest pounding in advance about how scientific psychology has proven something, there's a really good reason to think it's not true. And so that's how this has aged. And I would hope that contemporary academic psychology could learn something from that, you know. But I think instead they're running from him and towards scientificity in a way that prevents them from learning that there's actually some insight that isn't scientific, and that the more that they seek science, the more they may be leaving behind that insight and setting up people in the future to make fun of them. Can you believe what they thought back then? You know, because it is, you know, really funny sometimes, the things that Freud thinks is backed by indisputable science.
That's hilarious and fabulous. Okay, one more question, and then we should sadly cut this off and wait until the 26th to talk more. But I do want to ask about happiness. I want to ask a sort of philosophical Freud question. It's striking to me that he presents this utilitarian definition of happiness as pleasure in the absence of pain. I haven't read this text in a little while, so I don't remember, but I'm even wondering, based on the way that it plays out, whether it's not just utilitarian, but Benthamite utilitarian, and not really getting into some of the Millian stuff. But that's a more subtle question. But just keeping it on the question of utilitarian understanding of happiness. So he presents this utilitarian understanding of happiness, definition of happiness, and then makes the case that it's unattainable. And I wonder, and then you follow up with Aristotle. I assume you follow up with Aristotle's ethics. So you're getting a very different understanding of, happiness isn't even a great word for what Aristotle's doing, but fair enough, happiness, flourishing. So what happens, and if this is just too speculative and hard to just say so, but what happens if you plug in some more robust philosophical, maybe Aristotelian understanding of happiness and think through Freud's reasoning? Does everything just fall apart if you take away that particular definition of happiness? Or do some of these same things that seem to me, as you presented them, to be real insights about this sort of inevitability of dissatisfaction, the importance of certain kinds of substitutions or suppressions for the sake of civilization? I think you can, this is obviously not Aristotle's language, but you could talk about some of these things. And even though the ethics is written in a way that is pointing to this pinnacle of possibility, both in terms of external goods and in terms of dispositions and in terms of one's cultivation of oneself, one of the things you have to get to when you're teaching Aristotle is to say, this book is not just written for the person who has all of the perfect external goods, all of the perfect disposition, who's cultivated him or herself perfectly within a context of leisure. This presentation of this pinnacle set of conditions should be illuminating for all of us, regardless of sort of where we sit in imperfect versions of all of those things. So if you sort of put these texts together, when you put these texts together, do some of these insights about dissatisfaction and civilization and that human beings are dangerous, do they sit with a more robust sense of happiness? Or once you sort of get to the critique of Freud's understanding of happiness, does the rest of his argument sort of collapse around that?
So I don't know. I think there's some real philosophical work that needs to be done there. I guess what I'm tempted to say is this, that once you get a richer understanding of happiness, say from the Aristotelian tradition, I don't think you have to throw away Freud's claims that we are also animals with a lot of screwed up desires, right? In fact, Aristotle very much appreciates that. He's not an optimistic person about human nature. And for Aristotle, the ethics is about the interface of reason with our animal nature, that the reason we can have ethics in the first place is because our animal nature, especially in the emotions, can be guided, reframed, shaped, trained by the activity of reason, right? And so the crucial question for me seems to be, to what extent is Freud describing something that's like unchangeable and there? Like, I think the way he views it is that these primordial drives, all the screwed up Eros and Thanatos drives, are there permanently, and that we can kind of like harness them and manage them better. But I think for Aristotle, the assumption's a little bit different, which is that they're there, but they can also be reframed and reshaped and trained and harnessed differently. And Aristotle would add, and when you do so, they actually get more fulfillment. You actually get happiness there and not down at the level of the id, right? And I suspect that Aristotle is just on empirical grounds stronger there. And I think the evidence is that even with the most primordial drives in the id that Freud wants to talk about, say like lust and anger, aggression, that I think you get better at those with practice, right? It's not actually the untamed version of Eros or the untamed version of destruction that's talented and satisfying, that even those extremely animal level desires are increased in their beauty as well as their pleasure when they are properly tamed by reason. And I think that is Aristotle's strongest point against Freud. But that doesn't require that you get rid of what Freud is claiming. It requires that you put Freud in a context in which he's wrong about where ultimate happiness will sit, but that doesn't mean that you will ultimately get every single one of your impulses, fulfilled. Like Aristotle, I think, knows that. And virtue starts for him in the ability to train those impulses so that you get less and less resistance from them. And he sets up what I think is too much of an ideal of the virtuous man and his kind of purity. He gets rid of all, badness, basically, bad desires. I think that's too much of an ideal. But I do think that it's much more true that you become happier as you become virtuous than you become more miserable as you become more virtuous. Even though I think Freud is right that the more virtuous person often is beating themselves up. But that's not because they've just internalized an external repressive authority. It's also because they see the world more accurately. Like if reason works, this is the other big difference between Freud and Aristotle, I think for Aristotle, reason works. Okay? Reason, it doesn't mean that it works perfectly. Human beings possess reason imperfectly, but it actually opens us up to the world, and we can see differences between things, and we can recognize beauty. And I think that because fundamentally for Aristotle, reason is the thing that works and that is inherently good, whereas for Freud, reason is just basically a manager, or frankly a pimp, of our desires, right? Reason's job is to figure out how to fulfill the id's desires as best as possible. And so his vision of the human being is just like, well, we're a fiasco of these impulses, right? And then the ego has to come in and manage that. And that's what reason is. Whereas for Aristotle, reason works. And so for that reason, we should be optimistic that happiness can happen at that higher level. But I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think we both have to, for the sake of civilization, suppress our desire to keep talking all day, or redirect it somehow, because we do need to stop. This is just fantastic. I appreciate you taking your time to do this for us so much today, Molly. Let me remind everyone watching two things. Please join Molly and me on March 26th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, where we will meet on Zoom. You can find the links right where you found this video. We'll meet on Zoom for a continued conversation about this text, about Freud, about happiness, about core programs. If we would love for you to be a part of that, please share this with anyone who you think is interested. Everyone is welcome. One of the benefits of being on Zoom, despite all of the inconveniencies of us having to be apart, is that there is no limit to the number of chairs we can pull up to this table. So we hope you'll come and tell your friends and students and join us to have this conversation. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't remind all of you that the proposals we're accepting proposals for ACTC's annual meeting, which will be held online April 12th through 16th. Again, where you found this video, cortex.org, you can find all the information about submitting proposals and registering for our conference. We already have more than 100 registrations and proposals, and it's become my favorite part of this. Well, I don't know, it's one of my favorite parts of this new job, to read these new proposals every day and see all of the fantastic panels, papers that we're going to have at this online conference. So we'd love for you to be a part of that, and all the information you need is available on the website. So thank you, Molly.
Thank you. This is lovely. I appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is really great. And thank you for joining us. And I hope we'll see you on March 26th and again at our conference in April. Bye.